The envelope sat on the kitchen counter like a time bomb. Marcia Lewis stared at it, her hands trembling as she picked up the certified letter from the Internal Revenue Service. The words blurred together at first. Federal tax lien, outstanding balance, $147,382.16. But the number at the bottom came into sharp focus like a slap across the face. $147,000. Her father owed the government nearly $150,000 in back taxes. Dad? Her voice came out smaller than she intended, almost childlike. She was 21 years old, a junior at Northwestern University. But at that moment, standing in the modest Chicago apartment she'd grown up in, she felt like she was 10 again, asking her father to explain why they couldn't afford new school supplies. Robert Lewis didn't look up from his newspaper. He sat at the same scratched wooden table where they'd eaten countless dinners. His reading glasses perched on his nose, coffee growing cold in the chipped mug beside him. The morning light streaming through the window caught the gray in his hair, more gray than she remembered from just a few months ago. "What is it, sweetie?" His voice was casual, almost too casual. "This letter from the IRS." Marcia's hands shook as she held it out. "It says you owe them over $100,000. It says they're putting a lien on the house." The newspaper lowered slowly. For just a moment, something flickered across her father's face. Fear, maybe, or shame, before his expression settled into something she'd seen too many times before: resignation. "Oh, that." He folded the paper with deliberate care. "Don't worry about it, baby girl. These things have a way of working themselves out." Working themselves out? Marcia's voice rose despite herself. "Dad, they're threatening to take the house mom." She stopped herself, but they both felt the weight of the unfinished sentence hanging between them. The house her mother had loved. The house her mother had died in 3 years ago, after fighting breast cancer for 18 months. The house that held every memory Marcia had of her childhood, of family dinners and birthday parties and quiet Sunday mornings. Robert stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I said don't worry about it, Marcia." His tone had an edge now, the one that meant the conversation was over. "I've been handling my business for a lot longer than you've been alive." Handling it? The words burst out before she could stop them. "Dad, when was the last time you even filed taxes?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Her father walked out of the kitchen without saying another word. A moment later, she heard the front door close as he left for another day of flipping houses, the work he'd been doing for as long as she could remember, buying run-down properties, fixing them up, selling them for whatever profit he could squeeze out. Marcia sank into the chair her father had vacated, the IRS letter still clutched in her hand. Her mind raced through everything she knew about her father's business dealings, which, she was beginning to realize, wasn't much at all. She thought about how he'd always been paid in cash, how he'd avoided banks whenever possible, how he'd started depositing his house-flipping profits into her account last year, telling her it was because she was his treasurer now, that he trusted her to keep track of things. At the time, she'd felt proud, grown up, important. Now, sitting alone in the kitchen with that damning letter, a terrible thought began to form. Had her father been using her? The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and denial. Marcia tried to focus on her classes, but she found herself sitting in lectures at Northwestern, staring at her notebook without looking at the words. Her roommate asked if everything was okay. Marcia lied and said she was just stressed about midterms. The truth was she couldn't. Stop thinking about that number, $147,382.16. She couldn't stop thinking about what it meant, that her name was on a bank account that held money from her father's business, a business that apparently hadn't paid taxes in over 2 decades. On Thursday afternoon, she skipped her accounting class and took the L train home. She found her father in the garage, sorting through tools for his next house project. "We need to talk," she said. He didn't turn around. "I'm busy, Marcia." "Dad, please." She took a deep breath. "I went to the library. I did some research on tax debt and bank accounts, and—" Her voice caught. "Am I in trouble? Because my name is on that account with you? Because I've been depositing your money?" Robert finally turned to face her. For the first time since the letter arrived, she saw something like genuine emotion crossing his face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "You're not in trouble," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "How do you know?" Marcia pressed. "How do you know the IRS won't come after me too? That they won't think I was helping you hide money or because I won't let them." Her father's voice was firm now. "This is my mess, Marcia, not yours." "But it is mine." Tears pricked her eyes. "You made it mine when you put my name on that account. You made it mine when you started using me to hide your money from the government." "I wasn't hiding anything," Robert snapped. I was trying to keep what's mine. The government already takes enough from people like us. They don't need to bleed me dry, too." Marcia stared at her father, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. This man who'd raised her, who'd worked himself to exhaustion after her mother died, who'd always seemed so strong and capable. He looked old now, tired, and deeply, frighteningly lost. "Dad," she said softly, "when was the last time you filed taxes?" He turned back to his tools, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know. 23, 24 years. Maybe. Back before you were born. Back when your mother used to handle all that stuff." The admission hung in the air like smoke. "Why?" Marcia whispered. Robert was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "At first, it was just 1 year. We were struggling. Your mother had just gotten pregnant with you, and I'd had a bad year with the business. I thought I'd catch up next year." He laughed, a bitter sound. "But the next year wasn't any better, and then it became this thing I couldn't face. Every year that went by made it worse, made it harder to go back and fix. So I just didn't. For 24 years. For 24 years, he echoed. Marcia sank onto an overturned bucket, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. "What are we going to do?" "We aren't going to do anything," Robert said firmly. "This is my problem. You're going to go back to school, focus on your classes, and let me handle this." "How?" Marcia demanded. "How are you going to handle this, Dad? Do you even have the money to pay them back?" The look on his face told her everything she needed to know. That night, Marcia lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars she'd stuck to the ceiling when she was 8. They were fading now, their green light barely visible, but she'd never had the heart to take them down. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from her friend Jasmine. "You coming to study group tomorrow?" She didn't reply. Instead, she opened her banking app and stared at the account she shared with her father. The balance fluctuated wildly, sometimes as high as $15,000 when he'd just sold a property, sometimes as low as a few hundred. Right now, it sat at $8,147.32. Money that could be seized at any moment to pay her father's debt. Money that had her name attached to it. She thought about her mother, about how carefully Eleanor Lewis had managed their household finances, on a teacher's salary, how she'd clipped coupons and planned meals and made sure every bill was paid on time, how she'd kept detailed records in a series of spiral notebooks that probably still sat somewhere in a box in the basement. Her mother would have been devastated to know what her father had become. Or maybe, Marcia thought with a sudden chill, her mother had known. Maybe that's why she'd handled all the taxes when she was alive. Maybe she'd been the one keeping them afloat, and when she died, everything had started to sink. Marcia closed the banking app and opened her browser instead. She typed in a search. What happens if my parent puts IRS tax debt in my name? The results made her stomach drop. Potential legal liability. one article warned. Asset seizure, said another. Criminal charges for tax evasion if you knowingly participated in hiding income. Had she knowingly participated? No, she told herself. She'd had no idea what her father was doing. She'd just been helping him, being a good daughter, but would the IRS see it that way? She clicked on a link to a legal forum where someone had posted a question eerily similar to her own situation. My father hasn't filed taxes in years and put his business money in my account. Am I responsible? The top answer from someone who claimed to be a tax attorney made her blood run cold. You need to separate your finances from your father's immediately. Document everything. Get legal representation. The IRS will go after anyone whose name is on an account with unreported income, especially if large deposits have been made. You could be facing serious consequences if you don't act now. Marcia read the response 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass. She thought about her father, about how he'd looked in the garage earlier, defeated, ashamed, but still trying to protect her in his own broken way. She thought about her mother, about the careful, responsible woman who would never have let things get this bad. And she thought about herself, about the life she was trying to build, about Northwestern and her business degree and the internship she'd been hoping to land next summer at a financial firm downtown. All of it was at risk now. All of it hung in the balance because her father had spent 24 years running from the consequences of his choices. The tears came then, hot and angry and scared. She cried for her mother, who wasn't here to fix this. She cried for her father, who had broken something that might not be repairable. And she cried for herself, for the innocence of believing that family loyalty meant accepting whatever burden someone placed on your shoulders, even when that burden could crush you. When the tears finally stopped, Marcia wiped her face and made a decision. Tomorrow, she will do what her father couldn't bring himself to do. She would face the truth. The H&R Block office on Michigan Avenue smelled like coffee and stress. Marcia sat in a small consultation room, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she explained her situation to Marcus Chen, a certified public accountant who'd agreed to see her on short notice after she'd called that morning, her voice shaking as she tried to explain why she needed help. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. He was maybe in his 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of patient demeanor that made Marcia feel like maybe, just maybe, this situation wasn't completely hopeless. When she finished talking, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. First thing I need to tell you, Marcia, is that you did the right thing by coming here. His voice was gentle but firm. Second thing is, this is serious, but it's not the end of the world. People get through situations like this every day. Really? Marcia's voice was small. Really? Marcus pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Now, let's talk about what we need to do to protect you, and then we can figure out how to help your father. Over the next hour, Marcus walked her through steps she needed to take immediately. First, remove herself from any joint bank accounts with her father. Open her own account at a different bank. Transfer only money that was legitimately hers. Money from her part-time job at the campus bookstore, the small amount of financial aid refund she'd received. Second, stop handling any of her father's business transactions. No more deposits, no more withdrawals, nothing that could make it look like she was actively helping him hide income. Third, document everything. Every conversation with her father about the business, every deposit she'd made on his behalf. Create a timeline, showing exactly when she'd learned about the tax situation and what steps she'd taken immediately after. But what about my dad? Marcia asked, her throat tight. What should he do? Marcus's expression grew more serious. Your father needs to hire a tax attorney immediately, not a CPA like me. He's beyond that point now. He needs someone who specializes in criminal tax defense, because once you cross the 20-year mark of non-filing, the IRS can pursue criminal charges. Criminal? The word came out as a whisper. "I won't sugarcoat it for you, Marcia. Your father is facing potential jail time if he doesn't handle this correctly. The IRS is notoriously aggressive when it comes to long-term non-filers, especially those who've taken steps to hide income." He paused. "That said, there are programs, voluntary disclosure agreements, payment plans. If your father comes forward willingly and shows good faith in trying to resolve this, the outcome could be much better than if he continues to hide." Marcia nodded, trying to absorb all of it. How much would it cost? To hire a tax attorney? Several $1,000s, probably. Maybe more, depending on how complicated his situation is. She thought about the $8,147 in the account with her father's name on it, the money that was supposed to keep them afloat. It wouldn't even be enough to hire decent legal representation. "I don't think he has that kind of money," she said quietly. Marcus gave her a sympathetic look. "Then he needs to find it, because the alternative is much, much worse." Marcia sat in her car in the H&R Block parking lot for 20 minutes after the consultation ended, staring at her phone. She needed to call her father. She needed to tell him what Marcus had said about the criminal charges and the attorney and the absolute necessity of facing this head-on instead of burying his head in the sand. But she knew how that conversation would go. Her father would get defensive. He'd tell her she was overreacting. He'd say he'd handle it in his own way, in his own time. And meanwhile, the clock would keep ticking. The consequences would keep building. Finally, she dialed. Her father answered on the third ring. "Marcia? Shouldn't you be in class?" "I need to talk to you about something." She took a deep breath. "I went to see a tax professional today about your situation." The silence on the other end was deafening. "You did what?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Dad, I had to. I needed to know if I was in legal trouble because of the account, and you had no right." The words came out sharp, cutting. "This is my business, Marcia, my life. You don't get to go talking to strangers about my personal affairs." "Your personal affairs that you dragged me into," Marcia shot back, surprising herself with the force of her own anger. "You put my name on that account, Dad. You made this my problem, too. So yes, I absolutely had the right to find out what kind of trouble I might be in." She heard her father breathing heavily at the other end of the line. "What did they tell you?" he asked finally. Marcia relayed everything Marcus had said about separating their finances, about getting a criminal tax attorney, about voluntary disclosure and payment plans. When she finished, her father laughed. It was a hollow, bitter sound. "A tax attorney? Sure. And I'm supposed to pull several $1,000s out of thin air for that?" "Dad, if you don't do this, you could go to prison." "I'm not going to prison," Robert said, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "The IRS isn't interested in throwing a small-time house flipper in jail. They've got bigger fish to fry." "That's not what the accountant said." "Well, maybe the accountant is just trying to scare you into spending money on services you don't need." Marcia closed her eyes, frustration washing her over in waves. "Dad, please, I'm begging you. Let me help you find a lawyer. Let me help you figure this out before it's too late." "No." The single word was final, absolute. "I've survived this long without lawyers and accountants telling me what to do," Robert continued. "I'll figure something out. I always do." "By hiding?" Marcia's voice cracked. "By pretending it's not happening. That's not figuring it out, Dad. It's just giving up." "I'm not giving up," her father said quietly. "I'm protecting what's mine. And I'm protecting you, which is why you need to stay out of this, Marcia. Do you understand me? Stay out of it." Before she could respond, he hung up. Marcia sat alone in her car, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to dead silence. She thought about her mother again, about how Eleanor Lewis had faced her cancer diagnosis with the same calm, methodical approach she'd brought to managing their household finances. She'd researched treatment options, made spreadsheets comparing costs and success rates, created a detailed plan for how they would navigate the hardest thing their family had ever faced. Her father, Marcia, was realizing, had never learned how to do that. When faced with problems, Robert Lewis didn't make plans. He didn't research solutions. He just worked harder, longer, putting his head down and hoping that somehow, eventually, everything would work itself out. It was a strategy that had failed him spectacularly for 24 years, and now the bill was coming due. The next few weeks passed in a strange, suspended sort of dread. Marcia followed Marcus's advice in the letter. She opened a new account at a different bank, Chase, on the other side of town from where her father did his banking. She transferred exactly $1,047.32, the amount she could definitively trace back to her own earnings from her bookstore job. The rest, the $7,000 that had come from her father's house flipping, she left in the joint account. Let him deal with it. Let the IRS seize it if they wanted to. She wouldn't touch. Another penny that came from his business. She documented everything in a detailed spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, sources of funds. She saved every text message her father sent her about deposits or withdrawals. She wrote out a timeline of exactly when she'd learned about his tax situation and what steps she'd taken afterward. If the IRS came after her, she'd have evidence that she was an unwitting participant who'd immediately separated herself once she understood the situation. Meanwhile, her father continued as if nothing had changed. He flipped houses. He deposited cash. He avoided conversations about the IRS letter that Marcia knew he'd received more of. She'd seen them piling up on the kitchen counter, unopened, during her last visit home. It was like watching someone walk toward a cliff edge with their eyes closed, confident that their next step would land on solid ground. Then, on a Thursday in late October, everything came crashing down. Marcia was in her dorm room studying for a macroeconomics exam when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Hello? Is this Marcia Lewis? A woman's voice, professional and clipped. Yes? Ms. Lewis, this is Officer Patricia Morrison with the Internal Revenue Service. I'm calling regarding the joint account you hold with Robert James Lewis. Do you have a few minutes to speak with me? Marcia's heart stopped. This was it. She'd been dreading the call. Yes, I have a few minutes. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Ms. Lewis, I need to inform you that the IRS has initiated collection proceedings against Mr. Robert Lewis for outstanding tax debt dating back to 1999. As part of these proceedings, we've identified that you are a co-holder on account number ending in 4782 at Lakeside Community Bank. Is that correct? It was correct, Marcia said carefully, her hand shaking as she pulled out the notes Marcus had helped her prepare for exactly this scenario. I recently removed myself from that account. As of October 3rd, I am no longer associated with it. A pause. I see. And why did you remove yourself from the account, Ms. Lewis? Because I learned that my father hadn't been filing tax returns, and I didn't want to be implicated in his tax issues. I consulted with a CPA who advised me to separate my finances immediately, which I did. Another pause. Marcia could hear typing in the background. When did you first become aware of Mr. Lewis's tax situation? Officer Morrison asked. September 18th of this year, when I saw an IRS letter addressed to him about a federal tax lien. And prior to that date, were you aware that deposits were being made to the joint account from Mr. Lewis's business activities? Marcia's throat went dry. I knew that he was depositing money from his house-flipping business, yes, but I wasn't aware that there was anything illegal about it. He told me I was helping him manage his finances. I didn't. No, he wasn't paying taxes. This was the crucial part. If Officer Morrison believed her, she might be in the clear. If not, I understand. More typing. Ms. Lewis, I'm going to need you to provide documentation of when you removed yourself from the account, as well as any records you have of deposits or withdrawals you made on behalf of Mr. Lewis. I can do that, Marcia said, relief flooding through her. I've been keeping detailed records since I found out about the tax situation. Good. I'll be emailing you with a request for documents within the next business day. You'll have 30 days to respond. Officer Morrison paused. Ms. Lewis, I want to be clear with you. At this time, the IRS is not pursuing collection action against you personally. However, if we determine that you knowingly participated in concealing income or evading taxes, that could change. Do you understand? I understand. One more thing. Has your father consulted with a tax attorney or sought legal representation regarding his tax debt? Marcia thought about her father's stubborn refusal to get help. Not that I'm aware of. You might want to encourage him to do so, Officer Morrison said, her tone softening slightly. The IRS offers several programs for taxpayers who are willing to come forward voluntarily and work with us to resolve their debts. But those options close once we've initiated criminal proceedings. Criminal proceedings? Marcia whispered. In cases of long-term non-filing combined with active concealment of income? Yes, it's a possibility. She paused. I'm not at liberty to discuss your father's specific case with you, but I would strongly advise him to seek professional legal counsel as soon as possible. When the call ended, Marcia sat frozen in her dorm room chair, the phone still clutched in her hand. Criminal proceedings. Her father could go to prison. And suddenly, Marcia realized something that made her stomach turn. Part of her was relieved that she'd protected herself. Part of her was grateful that she'd separated her finances, documented everything, created a paper trail that showed she was an innocent party. But another part of her, a deeper part that felt sickeningly like betrayal, wondered if she should have tried harder to save her father from himself. She didn't tell her father about the call from the IRS. What would be the point? He'd already made it clear he didn't want her help. He'd already chosen denial over action. Instead, Marcia threw herself into her studies with an intensity that worried her roommate. She spent 12, 14-hour days in the library, memorizing financial theories and economic models, as if understanding the proper way money should work could somehow undo the damage her father had done by ignoring it for so long. 2 weeks after Officer Morrison's call, Marcia submitted her documentation to the IRS as requested. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every communication with her father about the account. She put it all in a neat folder and sent it via certified mail, then kept the receipt in case she ever needed proof that she'd cooperated. She tried to tell herself she was protecting herself. She tried not to think about how it felt like turning evidence against her own father. Then, on a cold November evening, her phone rang again. This time, the number wasn't unknown, it was her father's. She almost didn't answer. Hello? Marcia. Her father's voice sounded strange, defeated. I need you to come home. What's wrong? Can you come home? Please. The drive from Northwestern's campus to her father's apartment usually took 40 minutes. Marcia made it in 25, her heart pounding the entire way. She found her father sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd had that first conversation about the IRS letter. But this time, there were more letters spread out in front of him, official-looking documents with government seals. And sitting across from him, looking uncomfortable in the small, cluttered kitchen, was a woman in a dark suit. Ms. Lewis, the woman said, standing as Marcia entered. I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Your father asked me to wait until you arrived before we continued our conversation. Marcia looked at her father. His eyes were red, like he'd been crying. Dad? They're arresting me, Marcia. His voice was flat, empty. For tax evasion. The room seemed to tilt. Sit down, Ms. Lewis, Agent Torres said, not unkindly. We have some things we need to discuss. Marcia sank into a chair, her legs unable to hold her. Agent Torres explained the situation in clear, precise language. The IRS had completed its investigation into Robert Lewis's 24 years of non-filing. They determined that he'd actively concealed income, used his daughter's account to hide assets, and shown no willingness to voluntarily come forward and rectify the situation. The charges: willful failure to file tax returns, tax evasion, fraud. If convicted on all counts, her father faced up to 15 years in federal prison. However, Agent Torres continued, the U.S. Attorney's Office is willing to offer your father a plea agreement. Marcia's father looked up for the first time since the agent had started talking. If Mr. Lewis pleads guilty to willful failure to file and agrees to full cooperation in calculating his tax debt, the government will drop the evasion and fraud charges. He would face a maximum of 5 years, though the sentencing guidelines suggest closer to 2 to 3 years, given his lack of prior criminal history. And if I don't take the deal? Robert's voice was hoarse. Then we go to trial and you risk a much longer sentence if convicted. Agent Torres looked at him steadily. Mr. Lewis, I want to be straight with you. The evidence against you is substantial. You've admitted to multiple IRS agents that you haven't filed returns in over 2 decades. We have bank records showing unreported income. We have documentation of your attempts to use your daughter's account to shield assets. A trial wouldn't go well for you. Marcia felt like she was watching the scene from somewhere outside her own body. This couldn't be real. Her father, stubborn, proud Robert Lewis, who'd raised her and taken care of her and worked himself to exhaustion, was being offered a plea deal that would send him to prison. How long do I have to decide? Her father asked quietly. 72 hours. Agent Torres stood. I strongly suggest you consult with a defense attorney before making any decisions. And Mr. Lewis, the offer is contingent on your full cooperation, which includes paying back taxes plus penalties and interest. We've calculated your total debt at approximately $284,000. When Agent Torres left, Marcia and her father sat in silence. Finally, Marcia spoke. Why didn't you just talk to them when you got the first letter? Why didn't you try to work something out? Her father was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was barely a whisper. Because I was ashamed. Marcia felt tears prick at her eyes. I was ashamed that I'd let it go on so long. Ashamed that I'd failed your mother by not keeping up with things after she died. Ashamed that I couldn't just be a normal person who files their damn taxes every year, like everyone else. He looked at her, his eyes glistening. And I was terrified that if I went to them and tried to fix it, they'd take everything. The house, my business, everything your mother worked so hard to help us build. So instead, you let them take your freedom, Marcia said softly. Her father's face crumpled. They sat together in that small kitchen as the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the table, where letters from the IRS lay like gravestones, marking the death of the life they'd known. What am I going to do? Robert whispered. Marcia took a deep breath. You're going to hire a lawyer, a good one, and you're going to take the plea deal, and you're going to cooperate fully with the IRS to work out a payment plan for what you owe. I can't afford a lawyer, Marcia. I can't afford any of this. Then we'll figure it out. Marcia reached across the table and took her father's hand. Despite everything, despite the fear and the anger and the sense of betrayal, he was still her father. We'll sell the house if we have to. We'll sell your tools. We'll do whatever it takes to get you the best legal representation possible. The house was supposed to be yours, her father said, his voice breaking. When I'm gone, it was supposed to be yours. I don't want the house, Dad. I want you to have a chance at life after this is over. Marcia squeezed his hand. Please, let me help you. For the first time in weeks, her father nodded. The next 3 months were the hardest of Marcia's life. She took a leave of absence from Northwestern, despite her academic advisor's concerns that it would derail her graduation timeline. Some things were more important than staying on schedule. With her father's reluctant agreement, they put the house on the market. The same house where Marcia had grown up, where her mother had lived and died, where every room held memories of a happier time. It sold in 6 weeks for $340,000, enough to pay off the mortgage, hire a good defense attorney, and make a substantial down payment on her father's tax debt. Marcia helped her father move into a small one-bedroom apartment in a less expensive neighborhood. They donated most of the furniture. There was no room for it in the new place. And besides, starting fresh seemed right somehow. She found all of her mother's old notebooks in the basement during the move. Years and years of meticulous financial records, tax returns filed on time, and every receipt saved and categorized. Looking through them, Marcia understood for the first time how much her mother had shielded her father from. How much she'd protected him from his own tendency to avoid difficult things by simply handling them herself. When Eleanor Lewis died, Robert had been left to manage aspects of adult life he'd never had to face before. And instead of learning, instead of asking for help, he'd simply stopped trying. It was, Marcia realized, a kind of abandonment, not of her, but of himself. The defense attorney Marcia hired, a sharp, efficient woman named Jennifer Torres, who specialized in white-collar criminal defense, negotiated a better plea agreement than the IRS had initially offered. Robert Lewis would plead guilty to willful failure to file tax returns. In exchange, he'd serve 18 months in a minimum security federal facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release. His tax debt, calculated at $284,000, including penalties and interest, would be paid back over 10 years at 0% interest, with the IRS receiving monthly payments from his Social Security benefits once he was released. It wasn't a good outcome, but it was the best they could hope for. On the day of her father's sentencing, Marcia sat in the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, watching as the judge formally accepted the plea agreement. "Mr. Lewis," the judge said, looking at her father over the top of his reading glasses, "I want to be clear with you about something. Tax evasion is not a victimless crime. When people fail to pay their fair share, it places a greater burden on honest taxpayers who follow the rules. It undermines the entire system that funds our schools, our roads, our public services." Robert stood with his hands clasped in front of him, looking smaller than Marcia had ever seen him. "That said," the judge continued, "I've reviewed the letters submitted on your behalf, including one from your daughter that I found particularly moving. It's clear that you're not a bad person, Mr. Lewis. You're a person who made bad choices and then compounded those bad choices by refusing to face them for far too long." The judge paused. "I hope that when you complete your sentence, you'll use this experience to become the kind of person who faces problems head-on instead of running from them. Your daughter seems to have learned that lesson. Perhaps you can learn from her?" Marcia felt tears sliding down her cheeks as the bailiff led her father away. Federal Correctional Institution Greenville was a low-security facility about 2 hours south of Chicago. Marcia visited every other week, making the drive in her old Honda Civic and sitting across from her father in the sterile visiting room, talking about nothing and everything. At first, the visits were painful. Her father was withdrawn, barely speaking, clearly struggling with the reality of his situation. But gradually, something shifted. Maybe it was the structure of prison life, the inability to avoid schedules and responsibilities. Maybe it was the mandatory financial literacy classes that all inmates were required to take. Maybe it was simply having time to think without the ability to run away from his thoughts. Whatever the reason, Robert Lewis slowly began to change. He started taking online business courses offered through the prison's education program. He joined a therapy group for inmates dealing with shame and avoidance behaviors. He began sending Marcia a letter, specifically handwritten letter, stating about what he was learning, about the mistakes he'd made, about his plans for when he got out. "I'm going to do it right this time," he wrote in one letter. "I'm going to file my taxes every year like clockwork. I'm going to keep proper books for any business I run. I'm going to face my problems instead of pretending they'll go away on their own." Marcia kept every letter in a shoebox under her bed. Meanwhile, she returned to Northwestern, more than a year behind her original cohort, but more focused than she'd ever been in her life. She changed her major from generic business administration to accounting and finance, with a minor in ethics. If her family's catastrophe had taught her anything, it was that understanding money wasn't enough. You had to understand the responsibility that came with it. In her sophomore year, technically her fourth year of college, Marcia took a class called Financial Ethics and Corporate Responsibility. The professor, Dr. Aisha Williams, assigned a final project. Write about a real-world case of financial mismanagement and what ethical frameworks could have prevented it. Marcia chose to write about her father. It was the hardest paper she'd ever written, laying bare her family's dysfunction for academic scrutiny. But it was also the most honest thing she'd ever created. She wrote about how easy it is to make a single bad choice, to skip filing taxes one year because money is tight. She wrote about how that single choice can snowball into decades of compounding consequences. She wrote about the false sense of security that comes from believing that if you ignore a problem long enough, it will somehow resolve itself. But mostly, she wrote about responsibility, about how true financial literacy isn't just about understanding numbers and interest rates and tax brackets. It's about having the courage to face uncomfortable truths, the discipline to do difficult things even when no one is watching, the wisdom to ask for help before a small problem becomes an insurmountable crisis. She got an A on the paper. More importantly, Dr. Williams pulled her aside after class. "This was remarkably brave," the professor said. "Have you thought about what you want to do after graduation?" Marcia had, actually. "I want to work in financial education, helping people who are in situations like my family was, people who are overwhelmed and don't know where to start." Dr. Williams smiled. "I think you'd be excellent at that. Have you heard of the financial empowerment centers that the city of Chicago runs?" Marcia hadn't. They provide free financial counseling to low-income residents, tax preparation help, debt management, all of that. Dr. Williams pulled out a business card. "A former student of mine runs the program. I think she'd be very interested in talking to you about an internship." That conversation changed Marcia's life. Robert Lewis was released from FCI Greenville on a cold March morning after serving 16 months of his 18-month sentence, 2 months off for good behavior. Marcia picked him up in her Honda, which had gained another 50,000 miles during his incarceration. Her father looked different. Thinner, grayer, but somehow more solid, like he'd been hollowed out and filled back up with something sturdier than what had been there before. They drove back to Chicago mostly in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that didn't need filling. Robert had a new apartment waiting, a small studio that Marcia had helped him find, in a building near a church that ran a re-entry program for former inmates. He had a job lined up, too, working as a maintenance supervisor for a property management company. Not glamorous, but honest work with a regular paycheck. As they pulled up to the building, Robert turned to his daughter. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly, "for everything you did, for not giving up on me." Marcia turned off the ignition and looked at her father. "You don't need to thank me, Dad. You just need to keep moving forward." "I will." He paused. "Your mother would be proud of you, you know, the woman you've become." Tears pricked at Marcia's eyes. "I think she'd be proud of both of us for finally facing the truth." That evening, after helping her father unpack his few belongings, Marcia drove to her own apartment, a tiny place she shared with 2 roommates near campus. She made herself tea and sat by the window looking out at the Chicago skyline. Tomorrow, she'd go back to her internship at the Financial Empowerment Center, where she'd spend her day helping people navigate tax problems and debt crises, and all the complicated ways that money could destroy your life if you didn't face it head on. But tonight, she let herself feel something she hadn't felt in almost 2 years. Hope. Not the naive hope of someone who thought problems would simply resolve themselves, but the hard-earned hope of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side, scarred but standing. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father, sent from the basic flip phone he'd bought after his release. Made dinner, grilled cheese, ate at, the table, not in front of TV. Progress. Marcia smiled. Progress. 3 years later, Marcia Lewis sat across from a nervous-looking man in his 50s, her notepad open on the desk between them. "So, Mr. Patterson," she said gently, "when was the last time you filed your tax returns?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "It's been a while, maybe 7, 8 years." "And what stopped you from filing?" Marcia asked, her voice free of judgment. "I don't know. At first I owed money I didn't have. Then I couldn't face it. Every year that went by made it worse." He looked up at her with frightened eyes. "Am I going to prison?" Marcia thought about her father, about the path that had led from one unfiled return to federal incarceration. But she also thought about the dozens of clients she'd helped since then, people who'd come forward voluntarily, worked with the IRS, and avoided criminal charges entirely. "Not if we handle this correctly," she said. "The IRS has programs for people who come forward voluntarily. It's not going to be easy, and you will have to pay back what you owe, plus penalties. But if you're willing to face this problem head-on starting today, we can get through it together." The relief on Mr. Patterson's face was palpable. Over the next hour, Marcia walked him through the process. They'd file all his back returns. They'd apply for a payment plan through the IRS's Fresh Start program. They'd create a budget that would allow him to make monthly payments while still covering his basic needs. It wasn't a quick fix. It would take years to fully resolve, but it was a path forward, something Mr. Patterson hadn't been able to see when he'd walked into her office that morning. When he left, he shook her hand with both of his. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to me." Marcia watched him go, thinking about all the people she'd helped over the past 3 years since graduating from Northwestern and accepting a full-time position at the Financial Empowerment Center. She thought about the single mothers trying to manage business income without proper record keeping, the small business owners who'd fallen behind on payroll taxes and didn't know how to catch up. The elderly couples are facing IRS liens because they'd misunderstood the rules on retirement account withdrawals. People like her father, good people who'd made mistakes and then compounded those mistakes by being too afraid or too ashamed to ask for help. That evening, Marcia had dinner with her father at his apartment. Robert had been out of prison for 3 years now. He'd never missed payment on his IRS debt. He filed his taxes every year, on time, without fail. He'd even started taking community college classes in accounting. "Better late than never," he'd joked. He'd recently been promoted to senior maintenance supervisor at the property management company. It wasn't the house-flipping empire he'd once imagined for himself, but it was stable, honest, built on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by a single mistake. "How was it work?" he asked as they ate the spaghetti he'd made. "Busy. Helped a guy today who reminded me of you, actually. 7 years of unfiled returns." Robert winced. "What did you tell him?" "That it's not too late to fix it. That is the first step is always the hardest, but after that, it gets easier." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever regret it? Everything that happened? Having to take time off school? Using your savings to help me?" Marcia thought about the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "I mean, I wish it hadn't happened the way it did. I wish you'd gotten help earlier before things got so bad. But going through it taught me things I never would have learned in a classroom." "Like what?" Like how easy it is to convince yourself that you're protecting yourself by avoiding problems. How shame can be more powerful than fear. How the longer you wait to face something difficult, the more difficult it becomes. She paused. And how courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Robert reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're a better person than I ever was." "No," Marcia said softly. "I'm just a person who learned from your mistakes before I had to make them myself." 6 months later, Marcia stood at the front of a community center on Chicago's South Side, looking out at a room full of faces, mostly women, mostly middle-aged, all of them carrying the weight of financial struggles they'd been too overwhelmed or too ashamed to face. She was there to lead a workshop called Facing Financial Reality, a guide to taking control of your money. "Good evening, everyone," she began. "My name is Marcia Lewis, and 6 years ago my father was arrested for tax evasion." The room went absolutely silent. Marcia smiled gently. "I'm not sharing that to shock you or to make you uncomfortable. I'm sharing it because I want you to know that I understand what it feels like to discover that someone you love has been hiding a financial crisis. I understand the shame, the fear, the overwhelming sense that there's no way forward." She clicked to the next slide in her presentation. "But I'm here today to tell you that there is always a way forward. It might not be easy, it might not be quick, but if you're willing to face the truth, however uncomfortable, you can rebuild." Over the next hour, Marcia shared her family's story in all its messy, painful reality. She talked about her father's 24 years of unfiled tax returns, about the moment she discovered her name was on an account, holding unreported income, about the terror of not knowing if she'd be held legally responsible for her father's choices. But she also talked about the steps they'd taken to fix it, the lawyers they'd hired, the plea agreement they'd negotiated, the payment plan that had allowed her father to slowly, steadily pay back what he owed without being crushed by the debt. And she talked about what she'd learned through the process, lessons she now spent her days teaching to clients at the Financial Empowerment Center. Financial integrity, she said, isn't just about having money or knowing how to manage it. It's about having the courage to face reality, even when reality is terrifying. It's about understanding that a small problem dealt with today is always better than a catastrophic problem ignored until tomorrow. She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, women who saw themselves in her story, who recognized their own fears and struggles in what she was describing. "If there's one thing I want you to take away from tonight," Marcia continued, "it's this. Whatever financial problem you're facing right now, whether it's unfiled taxes or mounting debt or a business that's struggling, dealing with it today is the kindest thing you can do for your future self." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You don't have to fix everything at once. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to take the first step, make a phone call, open the letter, talk to a professional, face the truth. Because here's what I've learned over the past 6 years. The truth might hurt. It might be ugly and uncomfortable and hard to look at, but it can't destroy you the way that denial can. The truth is where healing starts. The truth is where you find your power back." When she finished her presentation, a line formed, women wanting to shake her hand, to thank her, to share their own stories of financial struggles they'd been hiding from their families, their friends, from themselves. One woman, probably in her late 50s, waited until everyone else had left before approaching Marcia. "I haven't filed taxes in 12 years, she said quietly. "My husband doesn't know. I've been terrified to tell him, terrified to face the IRS. But listening to you, tonight, I think I'm finally ready." Marcia pulled out a business card. "Call me tomorrow. We'll figure this out together." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You really think it's not too late?" "It's never too late," Marcia said firmly. "It just gets harder the longer you wait. So let's not wait anymore." That night, driving home from the workshop, Marcia called her father. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good, really good, actually." She merged onto Lakeshore Drive, the city lights reflecting off Lake Michigan to her right. "I talked about you, about us, about everything." "And people didn't run screaming from the room?" Marcia laughed. "No, Dad, they thanked me. A dozen women signed up for one-on-one financial counseling sessions. One woman is finally going to face 12 years of unfiled returns." 12 years, Robert said softly. "That's nothing compared to what I did." "That's not the point," Marcia said. "The point is she's facing it now before it becomes 24 years, before the IRS comes to her instead of her going to them. That's what matters." They talked for a few more minutes before saying goodnight. As Marcia pulled into her apartment building's parking lot, she thought about the strange, circular way that life had brought her to this moment. 6 years ago, she'd been a terrified college student who'd just discovered her father's decades-long secret. She'd felt betrayed, angry, and desperately afraid that his choices would destroy her future. Now she was using that experience to help others avoid the same fate. She was turning her family's greatest crisis into her life's purpose. Her mother would have loved the symmetry of that. Upstairs in her apartment, Marcia made herself tea and sat at her small desk, pulling out her laptop. She had a blog she'd been maintaining for the past year, Facing Financial Truth, where she shared stories, advice, and resources for people dealing with tax problems, debt, and financial shame. Tonight she wanted to write about shame specifically, about how it had kept her father trapped in a cycle of avoidance for 24 years, about how breaking through shame was often the hardest part of solving any financial crisis. She began typing. Shame is a liar. It tells you that your mistakes define you. It tells you that admitting a problem makes you weak. It tells you that hiding from the truth is the same as making it go away. I watched my father believe those lies for most of his adult life, and it cost him everything: his home, his freedom, years of his life spent in federal prison. But here's what I've learned. The opposite of shame isn't pride. It's courage. Courage to admit when you've made a mistake. Courage to ask for help. Courage to face a problem even when you're terrified of what you might find. If you're reading this and you're hiding a financial secret, taxes you haven't filed, debt you haven't acknowledged, a business crisis you haven't shared with anyone, please know this: you are not alone. You are not bad. You are not beyond help. You're just someone who made a mistake and is scared to face it. And that's okay. Fear is normal, but you don't have to stay frozen in that fear. You can take one small step today. Just one. Open that letter. Make that phone call. Tell one person the truth. Because on the other side of that fear, there's freedom. There's healing. There's a path forward that you can't see yet, but that absolutely exists. I promise you this: the truth is kinder than the lie, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Marcia hit publish and closed her laptop. Tomorrow, she'd wake up and go to work at the Financial Empowerment Center. She'd sit across from people who were scared and ashamed and convinced that their problems were unsolvable. And she'd tell them the same thing she told every client, every workshop participant, every person who reached out to her through her blog. It's not too late. It's hard, yes. It's uncomfortable, yes. But it's possible. You can face the truth. You can make it right. You can rebuild, one step at a time, one honest moment at a time, one courageous choice at a time. Outside her window, Chicago glittered under a clear autumn sky. Somewhere in the city, her father was probably preparing for bed, setting his alarm for his morning shift, maybe reading one of the personal finance books he'd become obsessed with since his release. Somewhere, a woman who'd attended tonight's workshop was sitting with her laptop open, staring at the IRS's voluntary disclosure webpage, her finger hovering over the mouse button as she tried to find the courage to click. Somewhere, someone was making the choice to stop hiding. And Marcia Lewis, daughter of a tax evader, survivor of her family's financial collapse, and now a professional guide for others facing similar crises, felt grateful for every difficult moment that had brought her here. Because pain, she'd learned, was only wasted when you refused to let it teach you. But when you faced it, learn from it, let it reshape you into something stronger, that's when pain became purpose. That's when crisis became calling. That's when shame transformed into strength. She thought about her mother, buried now for 7 years, but still present in every lesson she'd taught, every value she'd modeled, every moment of careful, responsible, honest living. "I'm trying, Mom," Marcia whispered to the empty room. "I'm trying to do what you would have done. Face it head on, help people, make it right." And somewhere, in whatever space exists beyond this world, Marcia liked to think that Eleanor Lewis was proud. If you've read this far, thank you for walking through my story with me. I know it wasn't always easy to hear. Financial crises rarely are. But I want you to know this. Whether you're facing unfiled taxes or mounting debt or a business on the verge of collapse, there is always a path forward. It might not be the path you wanted. It might not be easy or quick or painless. But it exists. The first step is the hardest, admitting that there's a problem and deciding to face it. After that, everything else becomes possible. If my family's story has resonated with you, if you're facing something similar, or if you know someone who is, please don't stay silent. Reach out. Talk to a professional. Find a financial counselor. Contact the IRS about their voluntary disclosure programs. The truth is that the IRS isn't interested in destroying people. They want their money, yes, but they also have programs designed specifically to help people who come forward voluntarily, people who show good faith in trying to make things right. But those programs only work if you're willing to take that first step. So I'm asking you, what's the financial truth you've been avoiding? What's the letter you haven't opened? The phone call you haven't made? The problem you've been telling yourself will somehow resolve on its own? Whatever it is, please consider facing it today. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Because I promise you this, 6 years from now, you'll be grateful you did. And if you have questions, if you need guidance, if you're looking for resources to help you navigate tax problems or financial crises, please reach out. Leave a comment, send a message. Visit my blog at facingfinancialtruth.com. You don't have to walk this path alone. My father walked it with me. I walk it with my clients every single day, and I'll walk it with you too. Because the truth, as hard as it might be to face, really will set you free. I've seen it happen over and over again, and I'd love to help it happen to you. Thank you for listening to my story. Now, I'd love to hear yours. What's one financial truth you've been afraid to face? How can I help you take that first step? Leave a comment below. And if this story spoke to you, please subscribe to the channel, because I share more stories like this every week, stories of courage and transformation and the power of facing your fears. Together, we can break the cycle of financial shame. Together, we can build something better. One honest conversation at a time.